My son called at 7:14 on a Tuesday evening, which should have been my first warning. He never called on weekdays. Weekdays were for work, or what he called work managing his wife's boutique that hadn't turned a profit in 3 years. Negotiating deals that never closed, attending networking events where everyone networked except him. "Dad, we need to come over." "Tonight." Not a question. The same tone he used ordering appetizers he planned to send back. They arrived 40 minutes later in the black Escalade I'd co-signed for 18 months ago. My daughter-in-law walked in first, which she always did. She had a way of entering rooms like she was appraising them for sale. She set her bag on my kitchen counter, the $3,200 bag my son mentioned casually at Christmas like the price was something to admire, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. My son sat down at the head of my dining table. My table. I poured myself a glass of water and waited. "Dad, we're in a situation." My son loosened his collar. He'd gained weight in the last year. The kind that comes from restaurant meals and borrowed confidence. The boutique owes more than we realized. There are vendors. There's a lease extension we signed. It's complicated. "How much?" My daughter-in-law slid the envelope across the table. $380,000. "But if we move fast, the creditors will settle for $260. I didn't open the envelope. I already knew the number. My accountant had been tracking their finances for 11 months, ever since my son forged my signature on a credit application. And one of the bank officers happened to be a man I'd hired 22 years ago when he was fresh out of college. He called me the same day. $260,000, I said. "It sounds like a lot, I know." My daughter-in-law leaned forward. She had a way of doing that, leaning in like she was about to share a secret, like intimacy could substitute for reason. "But you have the retirement accounts, the Fidelity one, and the one from the union. Together, that's almost, you know what's in my retirement accounts." She smiled, which was worse than if she hadn't. "You mentioned the amounts at Thanksgiving. We weren't snooping. Dad, don't call me Dad." The word landed harder than I intended. My son's jaw tightened. He'd inherited my jaw. Strong and stubborn. Though he used his differently than I'd used mine. I used mine to bite down and work through hard things. He used his to set before demanding someone else handle them. "Here's the thing," my son said, his voice shifting into the register I recognized from when he was 16 and about to explain why his speeding ticket wasn't his fault. "We're not asking for charity. This is a loan. Everything structured properly. Interest, repayment schedule, my lawyer drew it up." "Your lawyer. He's good, Dad. Yale-trained." I thought about the Yale-trained lawyer who'd drawn up the lease extension my son just described as a problem. I thought about my union pension, 31 years of 6 a.m., mornings in bad weather and concrete dust that still sometimes appeared in my lungs on cold days. I thought about my wife, who died 4 years ago, having never asked anyone for a single dollar she hadn't earned. "I'll think about it," I said. My son exhaled like I'd just agreed. That was the thing about him. He heard what he needed to hear and discarded the rest. They drove away 20 minutes later, the Escalade's taillights disappearing around the corner of my street, and I stood in my driveway for a long moment in the November cold. Then I went inside and called my attorney. Frank had handled my affairs for 19 years. He answered on the third ring, which for Frank at 9:30 on a Tuesday meant he was still at his desk. "They finally asked," I said. "How much?" $260 after settlement. The real number is $380. Frank was quiet for a moment. I heard him opening a drawer. "The paperwork." We prepared. "You want to move forward?" "I want to accelerate." We talked for 40 minutes. By the time I hung up, 3 things had been set into motion that my son wouldn't discover for weeks. The retirement accounts he'd studied so carefully were already in the process of being restructured into instruments his name could never touch. The house, which he'd assumed would pass to him naturally, had been transferred into a trust 14 months ago, a decision Frank had recommended after the forged signature incident and one I'd resisted longer than I should have. And the savings account, the one I kept at the local credit union where I'd cashed my paychecks for 3 decades, had a balance of $42. Everything else was somewhere he wouldn't think to look. I slept well that night for the first time in months. The kind of sleep that comes not from relief but from decision. I want to explain something about my son, because this story doesn't make sense without it. He wasn't always this. I watched him be born. Literally, the doctor let me stand where I could see, which was unusual then. And I watched my son come into the world red and furious. And I thought, that one has fire in him. For 17 years, the fire was good. He played baseball with real effort. He was kind to his grandmother. He worked 2 summers at my construction company, not as the boss's son, but with the crew, and the foreman told me, without prompting, that my son worked harder than men twice his age. Then he married at 26 and something shifted. Not immediately, not all at once, but my daughter-in-law had a talent for identifying what a person wanted most, and suggesting, gently and persistently, that they deserved it. My son wanted to be wealthy without the machinery of wealth, the patience, the repetition, the willingness to be wrong for years before being right. My daughter-in-law didn't create that want, but she knew how to water it. Over 8 years, I watched him become someone I recognized less each visit. The construction work he'd been proud of became something he described as what my dad does. The first loan request came 6 years ago. $50,000 for a restaurant concept that lasted 14 months. Then $80,000 for a distribution company that distributed nothing. Then smaller amounts, 30, 25, 15. Each one preceded by a version of the same conversation, each one followed by my daughter-in-law's careful accounting of why the previous venture had been sabotaged by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Total across 6 years, $412,000. I have every transfer documented in a spreadsheet Frank's paralegal helped me build. I never told my son I'd kept records. I wanted to see how long he'd keep asking while believing I'd lost count. The Thursday after their visit, my daughter-in-law called while I was eating lunch. She had a gift for timing, always called when she calculated I'd be alone and without distraction. I just wanted to check in, she said, which meant she wanted to nudge. I've been thinking, I said, which was true. Of course, take all the time you need. She paused. It's just that the window with the creditors is only open through the end of the month. After that, they file. And once they file, everything becomes public record. And that affects the boutique's relationships with, well, it cascades. You understand how these things work. I did understand. I also understood that the deadline was manufactured. Frank had already confirmed through a contact that the primary creditor had made no filing preparations and had, in fact, offered an extension that my son had not mentioned. I'll have an answer by next week, I told her. She thanked me warmly. She was always warm on the phone. My daughter-in-law. It was one of her skills. That weekend, I drove 4 hours north to see my grandchildren. This is the part of the story I need to get right. Because everything I did in the following weeks was built around one central fact. My grandchildren were not responsible for who their parents had become. My grandson was 11. My granddaughter was 8. They still made cards for my birthday with markers and construction paper. My granddaughter had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist. My grandson had taught himself 3 guitar chords from a YouTube video and played them for me every single visit, whether I asked or not. I had established accounts for both of them years earlier. 529 plans that had been growing quietly, and that existed entirely outside any financial structure my son could access or leverage. Frank had made sure of that specifically. Whatever happened with my son, my grandchildren's education would be funded. I'd made that decision before I'd made any other. When I arrived Saturday morning, my daughter-in-law was surprised to see me. She covered it well. She always covered things well. But I saw the recalibration behind her eyes, the rapid reassessment of what my unannounced visit meant. I spent the day with the kids. We went to a park. We ate bad pizza, and the kids argued about toppings with the passion of philosophers. My granddaughter showed me 3 different species of cloud formations she'd memorized from a book I'd mailed her in September. My grandson played me the 3 guitar chords. I told him honestly that they were improving. My son barely spoke to me all day. He stayed in his office, he called it his office, A room with a desk where he took calls and moved things from folder to folder without any visible result, and came out for dinner looking like a man waiting for a verdict. I left Sunday afternoon without discussing the money. I hugged both kids for a long time. My granddaughter asked when I was coming back. I told her sooner than she thought, which was true in ways she didn't understand yet. On the drive home, I called my older sister in Asheville. She'd known this day was coming. She'd been saying for 2 years that I was enabling a pattern that would only end one way, and she'd been right with the specific righteousness of someone who'd watched the same story with different names in her own life 30 years earlier. Her first husband had been a beautiful disaster, charming, talented, and constitutionally unable to function without someone else absorbing his consequences. "The cabin is ready whenever you are," she said. Ruth stocked the refrigerator this morning. My sister owned a property in the mountains outside Asheville, a 4-bedroom cabin she and her husband had bought as a retirement project. It had been sitting mostly empty since they'd decided the mountains were better in theory than in practice for their bad knees. She'd offered it to me in September when I first explained what I was planning, and I'd said I'd think about it, and then I'd spent 6 weeks trying to convince myself that a different ending was possible. It wasn't. I knew that before the Tuesday phone call. The Tuesday phone call just confirmed it clearly enough that I stopped arguing with myself. "Tell Ruth I'll be there Thursday," I said. The next 2 days I moved with the quiet efficiency I'd spent 31 years developing on job sites. Construction teaches you that preparation and execution are different skills. You can plan beautifully and build badly, or build quickly without a plan and tear it down twice. What you want is both. The plan complete before the first nail goes in. My plan had been complete for 8 months. Tuesday I met with Frank for 2 hours. Every document signed, every transfer authorized. I'd already redirected my pension deposits to an account in Asheville 3 months earlier. A gradual shift that would have looked routine to anyone monitoring my finances casually. My son had been monitoring my finances casually. Wednesday, I said goodbye to my house, the way you say goodbye to a place that's been good to you room by room. Quietly, without drama. My wife and I had bought it 27 years ago when the neighborhood was still raw and the trees were young. The kitchen still had the backsplash tile she'd chosen from 3 different samples spread across this same floor on a Saturday morning, and I'd said I liked them all equally because I genuinely did, and she'd laughed and said that was the least helpful opinion she'd ever received. I removed 2 photos from the walls. Her at our kitchen table the Christmas before she got sick, laughing at something my son had said, back when his laughter was still honest. The other was my grandson at age 4 in my work boots, both feet in one boot. So proud of himself that he'd achieved it. I left everything else exactly as it was. The furniture, the dishes, the books I wasn't taking. On the counter I left an envelope, a plain white one with my son's name on the front in my handwriting. Inside was a letter, 3 paragraphs, and Frank's business card. I locked the front door at 5:45 Thursday morning and drove north. My son called at 9:20 that morning. I let it ring. He called again at 9:47. At 10:15 he sent a text. "Dad, we need to talk before end of week. The creditor deadline is real." At 10:30 he arrived at my house with his wife and found no car in the driveway. I know the sequence because my neighbor Linda, who has lived next existing simultaneously, the way you can understand something completely and still wish it had been otherwise. My son finally called Frank at 4:15. Frank, professionally, told him exactly what I'd told him he could say. That I was well. That I was reachable. By written correspondence, sent through the firm, and that all matters regarding my estate and finances would be handled through proper legal channels. My son sent one more text at 6:30 that evening. It said, "Is this really what you want?" I read it sitting on my sister's porch watching the November mountains go purple in the last light, and I thought about the question for a long time. What I wanted was what I'd always wanted. My son becoming himself fully, rather than a lesser version sustained by borrowed resources. I'd wanted that for years. The difference now was that wanting it and funding his avoidance of it were no longer the same action. I didn't reply. The following weeks moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. In Asheville, my life slowed to something I'd forgotten was possible. My sister and her husband were easy company. They'd been married 38 years and had developed the peaceful telepathy of people who'd long since stopped competing with each other. We cooked dinners. I started running again, something I'd stopped after my wife died, and my knees had started complaining, and the world had felt too heavy for optional exertion. The mountain air was cold and thin, and after the first week my lungs adjusted, and I remembered why I'd played baseball for 15 years, not because I was talented, but because running felt like a solution to something I couldn't name. In the world I'd left, things moved differently. Frank sent updates every few days. My son spent the first week cycling through stages, confusion, then anger, then the panicked energy of someone who'd discovered the infrastructure they'd been leaning on was no longer load-bearing. He called my old colleagues. He visited my construction company, which my foreman Gary had been running for 4 years since I'd semi-retired, and made demands that Gary declined politely, and then firmly, and then on the advice of the company's own attorney. My daughter-in-law tried a different approach. She reached out to my sister, who she'd met twice at family gatherings, and apparently identified as a potential sympathetic channel. My sister listened to the full call 22 minutes. Frank later told me she'd timed it and then said, "I love my brother. This is the best thing anyone has ever done for your husband. Goodbye." She called me that night and we laughed until I had to sit down. The boutique's creditors filed on the 23rd of the month, not by the artificial deadline my daughter-in-law had cited, but on their own timeline. The filing was public record, which my daughter-in-law had warned me would be catastrophic for the business's vendor relationships, and it was, but the business's vendor relationships had already been compromised by non-payment, so the filing was less the cause of collapse than its official documentation. My son spent 2 days trying to reach me through every indirect channel he could identify. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 6 years texted me saying he'd heard there was some family trouble and was everything okay. My son had called him. I responded to my cousin warmly and said I was fine and asked about his daughter, who'd recently had her second child. The envelope. My son didn't open it the day he arrived because he didn't have access to the house. He retrieved it the following Monday with Frank's paralegal present, which was a condition Frank had specified any items left at the property could be collected only with legal oversight present. My son read the letter standing at my kitchen counter with Frank's paralegal 3 feet away. I know what was in the letter because I wrote it. I'll tell you what it said. It said, "I have been your safety net for 6 years, and it has not made either of us safer." It said, "The accounts you've identified no longer contain what you think they contain." It said, "Your children's education is fully funded and untouchable, and that will never change." It said, "I am not punishing you. I am doing the thing I should have done years ago, which is remove myself as an option so that you are forced to discover what you're actually capable of." It said, "Frank's number is on the card. When you're ready to talk as 2 adults rather than as a father and a son who never needed to grow up, I'll be here." My son read it twice. He didn't say anything. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and left. Frank's paralegal noted that he appeared neither angry nor defeated. "He appeared," she said in her email to Frank, "like a man who'd been expecting one thing and received something he didn't have a category for yet." I thought about that for a long time. December was cold in the mountains and beautiful in the specific way that stripped-down things are beautiful, the trees bare, the sky enormous, the distances visible that had been hidden in summer. I got a library card. I started building a small bookcase for my sister's cabin as a project for my hands, because 31 years of physical work had made my hands unhappy with idleness. My son called me on the 8th of December. I answered. He didn't speak for a moment. I could hear him breathing, and some background sound that might have been his car. "Where are you?" "Somewhere good. Are you safe?" The question surprised me. It was a son's question, not a creditor's. "Yes," I said. "Are the kids okay?" "They're fine. They're asking about you. My daughter wants to know if you're coming for Christmas. Tell her I'll call her Sunday." I always call her Sunday. Another silence. Then, "Dad, I don't entirely understand what you've done." "I know. Frank won't tell me specifics. Frank works for me. He's not authorized to tell you specifics. So what am I supposed to do now? I had prepared for this question because Frank had predicted it would come, and Frank has been right about most things for 19 years. What my son was really asking was, what are the rules of the new situation? He'd operated inside a structure where I was a resource, and now he needed a map of whatever structure had replaced it. Get a job, I said. A real one. Not a venture, not a concept. Something with a W-2 and a direct deposit. Pay your own utilities for 1 year. That's all I'm asking. 1 year. I have a family. I know. I'm not abandoning your children. Their tuition is already guaranteed through college. That is settled and permanent. But you, my son, need to learn what I learned when I was 23 years old pouring concrete in August. That money you earn feels different than money you're given, and until you know what that feels like, you won't know who you are. My son was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Flattened. Some of the performance taken out of it. What about the house? It's being managed. You'll receive a formal communication in January. You're not selling it? I haven't decided. That was the truth. I hadn't decided. The house was mine to decide about. Which was something my son was still adjusting to, that things I owned were mine to decide about. We hung up without resolution but without anger, which felt like progress. My daughter-in-law filed for a legal separation on January 14th. Frank sent me the notification with a single line of his own. As anticipated. I didn't feel satisfaction at this. I want to be clear about that. A marriage ending, even one that had caused considerable damage, is not a victory condition. My grandchildren had 2 parents who were separating, and that was a hard thing for children regardless of the circumstances that led to it. I drove up to see them the 3rd weekend of January, giving both my son and daughter-in-law notice in advance. I took the kids to a science museum my granddaughter had been asking to visit for a year. She lectured me on bioluminescence for 40 minutes with the focused authority of someone who has decided what they want to be and is working backward from there. My grandson found the aerospace section and stood in front of a decommissioned rocket engine with his mouth open for a full 3 minutes. On the drive back to their house, my grandson, who is quiet and observant in the way quiet children often are, they save their attention for things that matter, said from the back seat. Grandpa. Over said, Chen. Over said, are you and Dad still in a fight? We're working something out, I said. Is it about money? Partly. He thought about this. Dad seems different. Different how? Less loud. My grandson said. He's been going to work at the hardware store. He comes home tired. My son had taken a job at a hardware store. I didn't know this. Frank didn't know this. My son hadn't told me. I said, that's good work. He knows a lot about tools, my grandson said, with a matter-of-fact pride that nearly broke something open in my chest. He helped this lady in the plumbing aisle for like 20 minutes. She called the manager to say he was helpful. I drove the rest of the way without speaking because I didn't trust my voice. That night I called my son. He answered on the 2nd ring, and I could hear the tiredness in his voice, the specific tiredness of physical work that is also, if you let it be, a kind of satisfaction. I heard you're at Henderson's, I said. A pause. How'd you hear that? Your son is proud of you. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then my son made a sound that I hadn't heard from him in years, something between a laugh and something else. Something unguarded. I know about tools, he said. I worked with your crew 2 summers. I kept thinking I was too good for this kind of thing, and then this woman needed help in the plumbing aisle, and I knew the answer, and she was so grateful. Like, genuinely grateful. And I thought, when was the last time someone was grateful to me for something I actually knew? That's it, I said. That's the whole thing right there. We talked for an hour. Not about money, not about the formal proceedings Frank was managing, not about the separation or the boutique or any of the machinery of disaster. We talked about tools. We talked about the difference between PVC and CPVC and why it matters, which my son knew and which I knew, and which his crew of 2 guys at the hardware store apparently argued about daily. We talked about my grandson's interest in aerospace. We talked about my granddaughter's bioluminescence phase. which my son said had escalated into her wanting a saltwater tank, which he said he was considering if they could find a small one within a reasonable budget. Reasonable budget. My son said those words without irony or performance. I told him about the bookcase I'd built in my sister's cabin. He asked about the joinery. We disagreed mildly about whether I'd chosen the right wood, and it was the best argument I'd had in years. After we hung up, I sat on the porch in the January cold for a long time. The mountains were dark and the stars were the way they get at altitude, too many of them. More than the sky seems able to hold, crowded and brilliant and indifferent to everything happening below. February. My son filed a response to the separation that was, Frank told me, unusually reasonable. His lawyer, a different one than before, had apparently counseled him that contested proceedings would be expensive and prolonged, and my son had apparently agreed. My daughter-in-law retained her lawyer, and 2 weeks later my son called me and said the word aloud for the first time. The divorce is moving forward. How are you holding up? I'm okay, he said. I mean, I'm not okay, but I'm handling it. That's all handling it means. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in March. He sent me photos, which he'd never done before. Photos of a living room with a second-hand couch and a dining table that needed restaining and his guitar, which he'd started playing again for the first time since college. My grandson had apparently started learning alongside him. There were 2 guitars in the photo, one full-sized and one 3/4, leaning against the same wall. I had the photo printed and put it in a frame. My granddaughter called me one Sunday in March, which was our regular call, and in the middle of telling me about a documentary she'd watched about deep-sea creatures, she said, with the casual directness that children have before the world teaches them to soften things, "Grandpa, are you coming back?" "I'm planning on it." "When?" "When the time is right." "What does that mean?" I thought about how to explain it to an 8-year-old who wanted a specific answer. "It means I'm waiting to make sure the people I love are in a good place before I add myself back into the mix." Does that make sense? She considered this. Like how you wait for concrete to cure before you put weight on it. I had explained concrete curing to her when she was 6 during a conversation about why things need time to become strong. She had apparently retained this. "Exactly like that," I said. "Okay," she said, apparently satisfied. "The concrete's getting better." I drove back home in April. Not to stay permanently, the cabin had become something I wanted to keep returning to. A place I'd learned what my own life felt like without the weight of other people's choices. But home had things in it I missed. Linda next door, my coffee shop on Meridian where they knew my order. The construction company Gary ran so well that my presence was more tradition than necessity. But traditions have their own weight. My son met me for breakfast the first Saturday morning. He'd driven 40 minutes, arriving before I did, already at a table with coffee for both of us. He'd lost weight in the way that physical work and actual sleep produce not the hollow kind, but the kind that comes with a certain solidity underneath it. We ate eggs and talked about his job, which had expanded. Henderson's had given him a section to manage. He was good at explaining things to customers, he said, with a self-awareness I wouldn't have credited him with a year ago, because he'd spent years believing his own explanations without needing them to actually work for anyone. We talked about the kids. His daughter had her saltwater tank, 3 fish, a small coral, and what she described as a complete functional ecosystem. His son had learned 12 chords. We didn't talk about the money. Frank was handling the last of it through proper channels. My son had signed documents acknowledging the loans as documented. There would be no repayment. I'd structured it as a release for reasons Frank had advised, but the acknowledgement mattered to me. Not as accounting, as honesty. Before we left, my son said, "I owe you more than I can calculate." "You don't owe me anything." "That's not what I mean. I mean I was disappearing." He looked at his coffee cup. "I was getting smaller and more elaborate at the same time, you know? More scheme, less person. And I didn't. I couldn't see it while it was happening. I needed someone to be." He stopped. "To stop catching you." "Yeah." I left cash on the table for both of us. My son noticed and didn't argue, which was the right response. Small pride, correctly placed. Outside in the parking lot, before we got in our respective cars, my son hugged me. He's 2 inches taller than me, which happened somewhere around his sophomore year and which I have never entirely adjusted to. He held on for a moment longer than the performative version, and I felt in it the specific weight of someone who has learned something at cost and isn't taking the lesson lightly. "Come to the kids' thing next Saturday," he said. "My daughter's doing a presentation at the aquarium. She's been practicing for a month." "I'll be there," I said. I drove home thinking about my wife, which I do often. She would have suffered more than I did through the years of loans and manipulation because she had a quality I'd always loved and also sometimes envied. She felt things directly, without the buffer of analysis I used to slow my responses down. She would have been angrier sooner. She also would have understood what I'd done and why, because she believed in the same basic principle I'd finally acted on. That love unearned is not kindness, but sedation. That the hardest thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to protect them from themselves. There's a grandchild's drawing still on my refrigerator. My grandson made it when he was 7. 2 stick figures labeled Grandpa and me on a boat. We went fishing once on a lake outside the city and caught exactly nothing, and he declared it the best day of his life, which I believed then and still believe was true. The drawing stayed on my refrigerator through everything. I didn't need to take it with me because I knew it would be there when I came back. The morning of my granddaughter's aquarium presentation, she stood in front of a tank of jellyfish and explained bioluminescence to 40 strangers with the composure of someone who has never considered the possibility that the information she carries is anything other than vitally important. She was right. It was vitally important. The jellyfish pulsed behind her in blue and white, and she described the mechanisms without notes, answering questions from adults with polite patience. My son stood beside me. His son was on his other side with the guitar-calloused fingertips he was apparently developing. My daughter-in-law stood across the small crowd, and we nodded at each other with the civil acknowledgement of people who will need to navigate shared space for years and have decided to do it without waste. When my granddaughter finished, she looked through the crowd until she found me. She grinned her 2 front teeth slightly too large for her face, which will correct itself in a few years, but right now gives her smile an honest, oversized quality I hope she never entirely loses. I clapped until my hands hurt. Afterward, she found me immediately, with the unerring radar children have for grandparents at public events, and told me there was another species she hadn't covered because she'd run out of time and would I like to hear about it. "I have all the time in the world," I told her. She talked for 35 minutes. I didn't retain every detail. I retained what mattered, which was that she had found a thing she cared about and was building herself around it. The way you build anything that lasts, from the inside out, starting with what you actually believe, adding layers that can bear weight. That night I sat on my back porch, which faces a neighbor's oak tree that is much older than my house and will outlast it by centuries. I thought about the year that had passed, not with satisfaction but with something quieter. Not triumph. Continuance. The money is gone and I don't miss it the way I thought I might. What I have instead is a son who comes home tired from honest work and plays guitar badly with his son on weeknights. A granddaughter who knows things about light that I never will. A relationship with my sister that has deepened into something that will last the rest of our lives. The mountains in Asheville, which will be there when I go back in the summer, and a silence where the requests used to be. At first, that silence felt like loss. Now it feels like space. The kind you can finally hear yourself in. I didn't save my son by disappearing. I didn't punish him by removing my money. I just stopped being the thing he leaned on so heavily that neither of us could stand up straight. What happened after that was entirely his. The hardware store job, the apartment, the guitar, the calloused hands on his son's shoulders, he built all of that in the space I stepped back from. You can't give someone the life they're capable of. You can only stop giving them reasons not to build it. He called me last Sunday, which is not our regular time, just because he'd had a good day. A customer had come in to return something and ended up staying for an hour getting advice on a kitchen renovation. My son had drawn out a materials list on the back of a receipt, and the customer had taken a photo of it. He said I should charge for consultations, my son told me. Maybe you should. A pause. Dad, are you serious? I'm always serious about earned income. He laughed. The real version. And I could hear my grandson in the background trying to play a chord correctly and not quite getting it, and trying again.